Good evening. I'm Charles Coleman Jr. in for Stephanie Ruhle tonight, and we have got a lot to talk about. It is day 64 of the second Trump administration. And right now, the Trump White House is trying its best to figure out how a magazine editor was accidentally included on a group text where top officials discuss secret military plans. Andrea Mitchell has the details.
Days before U.S. fighter jets took off from the aircraft carrier Harry S. Truman in the Red Sea for strikes against the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, a security breach with potentially catastrophic consequences for the U.S. military. Details of the U.S. war plans shared in real time with The Atlantic's editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg by accident on the unclassified commercial messaging app Signal.
I assumed that I was being spoofed or hoaxed or being included in some kind of disinformation campaign, because it was simply too improbable to me that they would have such poor operational security as to inadvertently invite the editor of The Atlantic into a national security discussion about the timing of a bombing campaign.
But it was deadly serious. Goldberg says he was added by a user, National Security Advisor Mike Walls, to a group chat, including the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, the CIA Director, and the Director of National Intelligence, sharing precise information about weapons packages, targets, and timing. Shocking Senate Intelligence Vice Chair Mark Warner.
Holy crap. I mean, when this level of detail is being shared on a non-classified network, and this isn't the first time we've seen this sloppiness from this administration. Early on, there were a couple hundred CIA agents whose identities were exposed.
Goldberg says he removed himself from the chat after the attack. The National Security Council says the chat appears to be authentic, adding, "We are reviewing how an inadvertent number was added to the chain, and there was no threats to our service members or our national security." The president reacting tonight.
The Houthis, you mean the attack on the Houthis? Well, it couldn't have been very effective, because the attack was very effective, I can tell you that. I don't know anything about it.
Tonight, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was asked how war plans could have been shared with a journalist.
Talking about a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again, to include the hoaxes of Russia, Russia, Russia. I've heard I was characterized. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that.
Now, several top intelligence officials will be on Capitol Hill tomorrow for a previously scheduled hearing with the Senate Intelligence Committee. That grouping is going to include Tulsi Gabbard and CIA Director John Ratcliffe, who appeared to be part of that group text. Meanwhile, today, an appeals court took up the case of the Trump administration using the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelan migrants. One judge said that Nazis got better treatment during World War II than these migrants have received. Kelly O'Donnell has more on that.
Today, a three-judge federal appeals panel heard arguments as Trump administration lawyers seek to overturn Judge James Boasberg, who temporarily blocked deportation flights using the 18th century law. The administration says the judge went too far.
The district court's order represents an unprecedented and enormous intrusion upon the powers of the executive branch.
In a notable court exchange, Judge Millett raised concerns about the deportations.
There were plane loads of people. There were no procedures in place to notify people. Nazis got better treatment under the Alien Enemy Act.
A literal reference to the law's use during World War II that prompted this response from the government's lawyer.
Well, Your Honor, we certainly dispute the Nazi analogy.
While Trump border czar Tom Homan reacted with outrage.
We removed terrorists. And to compare that any way whatsoever with Nazis is disgusting on every level.
If this seems like a lot, it is, y'all, but there's more. President Trump is attacking more law firms now, threatening to sanction any firms that file suits against the administration that they find to be frivolous. That directive came from a White House memo that was issued late Friday night. The Wall Street Journal reports that memo and the president's successful pressure campaign against high-profile firm Paul Weiss has firms across the country scrambling to stay out of Trump's crosshairs. Now, with that, let's bring in our leadoff panel for tonight. David Drucker, senior writer at The Dispatch, is joining us along with Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker, and my good friend, super lawyer Barbara McQuaid, a veteran federal prosecutor and former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. Susan, break down how wild what we're talking about in terms of this situation, hearing that top officials included a magazine editor in a group chat that was discussing secret military plans.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Veep came back to life as a real-life Trump administration reality show drama today. And even then, by the way, had we pitched this plot to the screenwriters, they would have said, no way, come on, that's too insane, even by the standards of fiction. OK, this is crazier than fiction. And it's also just so much more revealing, I think, about where we're at 9 weeks to the day into this second Trump administration. The same people who wanted to throw Hillary Clinton in jail for using a private email server are the same people texting each other apparently classified war plan information. I think Jeff Goldberg, it strikes me that he handled this as responsibly as you could while thinking that it was a hoax, because how could it possibly be real? As soon as he realized, according to his account, that the strikes against the Houthis that he had read about on this text chain were exactly happening when the text chain said that it would, that's when he signed out of it. Really struck by the incredibly intemperate comments by the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that you showed in the introduction today, Charles. In contrast to the responsibility of the magazine editor, the idea that the Defense Secretary of the United States, having already shared this secret, top secret information about our war plans over an unsecure chat app with a journalist, that he would attack the journalist for being fake news, I think tells you everything about where we are as a society. It's a pretty shocking thing. And the question I have is whether any Republicans on Capitol Hill who voted for this man just a few weeks ago to be defense secretary, whether they're going to even try to call him to account for this kind of reckless behavior.
David, Susan raises a very good point. Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, handled this very responsibly, but it raises a ton of other questions. Are there other threads? Are there other people who have just sort of sat in silence while on similar threads that are now running around with national secrets? Jeffrey Goldberg was actually on with Jen Psaki on her show tonight, and he responded to Pete Hegseth. Here's what he had to say. Let's take a listen.
The specific time of a future attack, specific targets, including human targets, meant to be killed in that attack, weapons systems, even weather reports, that the government is I don't know why Hegseth was sharing it with everybody. I mean, the precise detail, and then a long section on sequencing. This is going to happen, then that is going to happen. I've been, asked this question a few times today. It's why did you have such a hard time believing this? Mm-hmm. And the answer is because it's unbelievable.
David, is the word unbelievable? Is that really the word? And is this more of an embarrassment to the Trump administration that it happened, or is the concern what else is out there that we don't know about?
Well, let's just deal with what we know. And I think it is rather unbelievable. There's been a lot of focus on the fact that Jeffrey Goldberg was included on this chat accidentally. First of all, in reference to the Secretary of Defense's comments, he's neither deceitful nor discredited. He's a pretty good journalist. I don't, throw in compliments like that lightly. But I don't really care that a journalist was included on this. The fact that senior U.S. government officials, as senior as the vice president and the White House chief of staff and the Secretary of Defense, the CIA director and the director of national intelligence, were having this discussion on a commercial chat platform is what should be concerning and what deserves the focus, not the fact that they accidentally included a journalist that allowed us to be aware of this. Our enemies and our adversaries are good enough at hacking our secure government systems, so-called secure government systems, that we don't need to make it easier for them. And it wasn't just that they were having a philosophical discussion about how to handle the Houthis, who have been disrupting shipping channels and making it difficult for the West to transport goods around the world, and what should be done about that. They disclosed very specific war plans, times, places, methods, to the point where Goldberg declined to detail all of it in his reporting because it would compromise U.S. national security. When Republicans over the past 10 years have referenced Hillary Clinton's private email server while she was Secretary of State and said that it endangered U.S. national security because it was moving information off of secure government platforms, they were right. And this is no different. Secondarily, U.S. Government communications under the Presidential Records Act are supposed to be preserved, and platforms like Signal are designed to not preserve things, to put it plainly. And if low-level government officials or members of the military had done this, they would be fired and possibly prosecuted. That's what usually happens when you're a low-level government official who does this. In fact, private sector corporate officials who do business with the U.S. government that inadvertently disclose U.S. Proprietary or classified information on non-secure platforms also are subject to firing by their employers. And so this is very serious. The fact that Jeffrey Goldberg was included inadvertently in the chat is really beside the point.
You know, we cannot ignore the irony here that Pete Hegseth has been the one to talk and make a hallmark out of both meritocracy and competence, and we are not seeing either of that in this situation. Barbara, David sort of talked about this with respect to a lower level employee would have been dismissed for something like this. You know what time it is. I'm taking off the glasses. I'm talking to a lawyer, Barbara. Is there any chance that the law was broken here in terms of this, what was shared? And does something like this potentially undermine this administration's own credibility when it comes to actually prosecuting folks around issues of national security breaches?
Absolutely. It appears first that the Federal Records Act has been violated here by using a private app for messaging as opposed to official government channels. The reason we have a Federal Records Act is to keep track of what is communicated, to have a record of those things. So simply using a private device or a private signal chat alone is prohibited. But something even more serious than that is this is a potential violation of the Espionage Act. I know the term Espionage Act suggests that there's spying involved, but it also relates to the protection of classified information and national defense information. So even if this information were not classified at the secret or top secret level, we know it pertains to the national defense. And the Espionage Act makes it a crime for someone who has lawful access to national defense information to disclose it to someone who does not have authorized access to that information through gross negligence. Now, Barb, I would submit that, number one, using Signal alone is gross negligence, but adding a journalist is even more gross negligence.
Now, Barb, you're a DOJ vet. What's the likelihood that we see Pam Bondi actually investigate that and determine whether the Espionage Act was in fact violated?
I would say in any other administration, I think that there would be a strong likelihood of that. I think when it comes to Pam Bondi, based on some of the things that she has said and her loyalty to Trump in this administration, I'd be very surprised if we do see an investigation.
Susan, I was just talking about the notion of meritocracy and the importance of competence and merit, and that's something that we've heard a lot from President Trump, Elon Musk, and Pete Hegseth about. I want to play something and get your reaction on the other side.
It is a big deal, merit. Our country is going to be based on merit again. Can you believe it?
I think it's what the president mentioned earlier, which is that in order to save taxpayer money, it comes down to two things: competence and caring.
We believe that whether you are a doctor, an accountant, a lawyer, or an air traffic controller, you should be hired and promoted based on skill and competence, not race or gender. Very important.
Talk about things that did not age well. Susan, what does it say if the Trump administration does not seek to issue some sort of public rebuke or discipline of either Hegseth and or Walz in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's talk about this in a real way. Pete Hegseth was not chosen for his skill, competence, resume, background, experience. His predecessor, who they've denigrated in the job, Lloyd Austin, was a former four-star general in the United States military. Pete Hegseth was a National Guard lower-level official who ran a couple of small nonprofits before being a weekend television anchor on Fox News. And he has been inveighing about DEI and competence and skills. And I think it's an example of how, in many ways, the Trump administration has been gaslighting America. They've been busy undertaking essentially a culture war on what Hegseth and Trump call the enemy within. Donald Trump in his campaign, in an interview in October before the election, he said there's Russia, there's China, those are our adversaries, but the bigger adversary is the enemy within. And the enemy that they've been doing is purging the Pentagon's websites of words like women in combat, of the Enola Gay, because the word gay or something. And, I think that this incident with the signal chain of all of the entire top national security leadership of our country, it's the kind of thing that I don't expect it will shock the Trump administration into acting differently, but it is a marker of how far we've come, that we don't even expect that there's going to be a special prosecutor appointed for this. We don't expect congressional hearings. It's the degradation of our system that we can't even police ourselves and hold our top national security officials accountable for following the rules that they expect others to follow.
Barbara, I have to ask you about this Paul Weiss story because it's very fascinating for me. Can you sort of lay out for our viewers very quickly how significant it is for the Trump administration to go after these law firms? And for those viewers who don't know, the significance of a Paul Weiss, we're not talking about a mom and pop legal shop here. This is a huge law firm, and what that implies going forward as it relates to private industry, the legal industry, and this administration.
Yeah, so we've seen now Donald Trump target 3 separate law firms, one Covington and Burling, because they provided services to Jack Smith, the special counsel, Perkins Coie, because they employed a lawyer that represented Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, and Paul Weiss, because they had a lawyer formerly at the firm who worked on the hush money investigation against Donald Trump. So what appears to be purely retaliation, Donald Trump targeted all 3 of those law firms and said he was stripping them of their security clearances. He was terminating federal contracts. And in the case of one of the law firms, even prohibiting them from entering federal buildings, which means they cannot perform their livelihood. So we've seen different responses. Covington and Burling is kind of just keeping on doing the same work they always did. Perkins Coie filed a lawsuit and got a temporary restraining order from a court finding constitutional violations. But Paul Weiss chose a different path. They chose to negotiate with President Trump and agree to perform $40 million of pro bono services, free legal services, to Donald Trump's favorite causes. That, to me, is a very disturbing choice, because although they may be seeking to protect their clients and their own livelihood, it also suggests that you can bargain when people are trying to extort you. It's like when the bully steals your lunch money. If you give the bully your lunch money, they're going to come back for more. So the worry, of course, is that when we see a Paul Weiss appear to capitulate as they did, it gives Donald Trump just all the more ammunition to go after other law firms and do the same. And the fear is that clients won't hire firms that fall into Donald Trump's disfavor, and other firms, in an effort to avoid his disfavor, will stop representing clients who might be in opposition to him.
A lot of ground to cover, and 3 of the best to get us started in terms of doing it. David, Susan, and Barbara, thank you all. And when we come back, the Trump administration continues to face questions after its national security team accidentally included the Atlantic's editor-in-chief on a group chat about U.S. attack plans in Yemen. Here to discuss is Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. He previously served on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thank you for being here. Just give me your blanket reaction to this news about this essentially group chat about military activity.
Pete Hegseth thinks that Pete Hegseth should be fired. If you listen to what he has said over the years on his weekend shows, he has called out people for instances of national security that were not even close to what he did as far as his breach for them to be gone. So it's actually remarkable to me that as we talk right now, Pete Hegseth has not resigned. He should absolutely resign. He may have violated the Espionage Act, as some of your other guests have said. He also violated the Don't Be an Idiot Act. And it's also concerning that the other people in the group chat didn't say, hey, should this even be on Signal? Or two, are we allowed to have disappearing messages considering all the records we're supposed to keep? And three, hey, who's that number that none of us recognize? And so this is, of course, very concerning. And as someone who represents, a pretty big troop community with a military base in one of the biggest cities in my district, this puts all of their security at risk. So it's shocking that he's still the Secretary of Defense.
Congressman, given everything that you've just said, how prepared are Democrats to push the call for Hegseth's resignation? You've said that this is something that really should result in him leaving this post. Are Democrats ready for that fight?
Hey, I'm ready for it. And we have to meet the moment right now because our adversaries, our enemies in the world, are looking at this clown show and they're wondering, is this the time to maybe invade Taiwan because America doesn't have its act together? Is this the time, for our terrorist organization to hit America because these morons are on the watch? And so, yes, we have to meet this moment right now, call for his resignation, and also insist that we have all the records that they have tried to delete so we understand just what else has been put at risk.
Now, you and former Republican Congressman David Jolly were just in the Tampa area for a town hall in a Republican district. Let's take a look at the reception that you both received.
Anna Paulina Luna refuses to meet with her constituents. To that, David and I say, to hell with her, we'll talk to you. We'll listen to you, and we will fight for you.
Tell us a little bit about what you were hearing from the people while you were there.
Well, I heard from Democrats, independents, Republicans, people who see their health care security at risk. They see President Trump and Elon Musk getting rid of FBI agents who are supposed to keep us safe, bird flu monitors who are supposed to, keep the price of eggs down, CDC scientists who are supposed to prevent the measles outbreak that we're seeing. And they want to know what's the plan. And what David Jolly and I told them is the plan is small victories lead to big victories. We have to win in Wisconsin on April 1. We have to fight hard in the 2 Florida special election seats on April 1. We have to win the governor races in New Jersey and Virginia later this year, and that'll build momentum so that we can win the House. And right now, inside the Congress, we have to fight back against any bill that gives billionaires the biggest tax breaks and takes away Americans' health care. And we have to fight in the courts where we can put speed bumps up all along the way as they're trying to inflict this pain. But small victories can lead to big victories if we all are willing to go, as I call it, one rung higher than we've ever gone in the past. So if you've never been to a protest before, go to a protest. If you've never gone to a city council meeting, go to a city council meeting. And if you have never thought about the Wisconsin Supreme Court race on April 1, Elon Musk is, so you probably should too.
Congressman, I can't help but to think about when you get on an airplane and they say, secure your mask before you secure the mask of someone else. Democrats right now, and this is supported by a poll from Quinnipiac, is showing that they're underwater with their own voters for the first time in this poll's history. So while I can appreciate you going to Republican districts and having these conversations with other folks, it seems like there's a need for you, your colleagues, and the rest of the party to really secure your actual voter base. How does that actually happen before you go out to these other districts that haven't supported the Democratic Party in previous elections?
Yeah, I'm at the SFO airport about to fly to DC, and that's why I'm in this very hostage-looking like room, by the way. Look, we have to show up. We have to hear the voters, tell them what the plan is, tell a better story, always be on, go to the places and spaces we have not gone before, and be fearless and recognize it's all on the line right now. Because if we don't win the midterms, I can't look you in the eye and guarantee we're going to have a free and fair election in 2028. That is the urgency of this moment.
Congressman Swalwell, thank you very much for joining us, and safe travels back to D.C. When we come back, the U.S. is hoping for a Ukraine peace deal, but Russia doesn't seem to be in much of a hurry. We'll get into that and more next on the 11th hour. Today, Russia and the United States sat down for a new round of negotiations. The focus appears to be securing a partial ceasefire in Ukraine, but the Kremlin is already warning that the talks will be difficult. And further complicating the negotiations, Russia launched a massive drone strike overnight. Here with us, William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He is also a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador, what do you make of Russia already signaling to everyone that things will not go smoothly?
Charles, the Russians are playing for time. The Russians want to drag this out. The Russians are in no hurry to come to an agreement, and that's going to put them in conflict with President Trump, who has, as you know, has made this a very high priority. He said he was going to solve this in 24 hours. That was not serious, he knew, but he does put a very high priority on this. And he and President Zelensky, President Trump and President Zelensky have agreed on a broad ceasefire. And as you indicated, President Putin has said no. President Putin is dragging this thing out.
So you've already talked about the fact that this administration has a lot riding on these negotiations going well. If you had to anticipate what the pivot could be from this administration if these ceasefire talks fail, what does that look like?
I think if these ceasefire talks fail, and it's clearly the fault of the Russians are seen to be the bloc, then I think you can see some real pressure being brought on Putin and on Russia. And President Trump has some leverage. He has some cards to play. He can certainly keep and even increase the flow of funds and armaments and ammunition to the Ukrainians to allow them to continue to push back the Russians. President Trump can also increase, he said he's ready to increase sanctions on the Russian economy. The Russian economy is pretty fragile on the civilian side, and more sanctions and more enforcement of existing sanctions could have a real effect. The last thing, Charles, it seems like to me that President Putin really wants President Trump to bring him back in from the cold, if you will. He wants to be part of the international community again. And he's right now a pariah to the West. And he is an indicted war criminal, for that matter. So Putin is looking for Trump to bring him back in. And Trump doesn't have to do that. If Putin is stopping Trump's priority of stopping this war, then he could pay the consequences.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this timeline. U.S. officials met with the Ukrainian delegation yesterday, and as we mentioned, today's meeting with Russia came after the Kremlin launched an overnight attack on Ukraine. How does all of that affect the future of these talks?
Well, the talks continue back and forth. You're right. The Americans talked to the Ukrainians yesterday, talked to the Russians today, and they'll probably talk to the Ukrainians again tomorrow and back and forth. There are several stages, Charles, as you've indicated. The first is to get a ceasefire to stop the attacks on energy infrastructure. The second, apparently, is to see if they can apply a ceasefire to the sea, to the Black Sea, so that both sides can export. This will be important for the Ukrainians to be able to export their grain. The Ukrainians and Russians had a deal on a ceasefire on these seaports and the export lanes, and the Russians pulled out. And then the next stage may well be a ceasefire in the air and then on the ground. So it's step by step, Charles. And after the ceasefire, then comes the real significant discussions on a settlement and how they actually settle this war that the Russians started back in 2014 and then expanded in 2022.
You talked a little bit about the priorities for Ukraine in terms of what they're looking for. What do you think is Russia's biggest sticking point as part of these ceasefire negotiations?
Russia all along has been very clear. They want to dominate Ukraine. They want to eliminate Ukraine. They say that Putin says Ukraine doesn't even exist, and therefore he wants to wipe it out. He wants to take it away. There is no stopping Putin on that. And if he does that to Ukraine, he will do that further. And the Ukrainians, of course, are fighting for their existence. They are not going to stop fighting, even though Putin wants to eliminate them. They don't have a choice, and they will continue to fight. They've been fighting, Charles, for 1,125 days against the Russian army and have held them off. They'll continue to do that.
Ambassador Taylor, thank you for breaking all of this down for us tonight. We appreciate it. And when we come back, tomorrow morning, the president's pick to lead the Social Security Administration will face questions from senators on his nomination as Elon Musk has vowed to weed out mass fraud at the agency. But the Washington Post notes those claims are at odds with the agency's audits and reports. How do you find fraud when it's not even clear whether the fraud exists in the first place? The Social Security Administration's Inspector General last year found that less than 1% of Social Security's payments were determined to be improper, and that was often the result of accidental oversight or a change in benefit status. Now, that hasn't stopped DOJ from barreling ahead with cost-cutting tactics that experts are warning could potentially cause payment interruptions for the first time ever. But according to Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, only fraudsters will care if they miss a check.
Let's say Social Security didn't send out their checks this month. My mother-in-law, who's 94, she wouldn't call and complain. She just wouldn't. She'd think something got messed up, and she'll get it next month. A fraudster always makes the loudest noise, screaming, yelling, and complaining. And if all the guys who did PayPal, like Elon knows this by heart, right? Anybody who's been in the payment system and the process system knows the easiest way to find the fraudster is to stop payments and listen. Because whoever screams is the one stealing.
Now, I don't know Mr. Lutnick's mother-in-law, but I can introduce him to a bunch of seniors that might like a word on this. Joining me now to discuss is Democratic strategist Joel Payne. He was also a senior aide for Hillary for America and press secretary for former Senator Harry Reid. And Charlie Sykes, MSNBC columnist and political analyst. Joel, let's get started with you. Now, there's a reason that Social Security is regarded as a third rail of politics, but the Trump administration does not seem to care. What do you make of this attack on this institution?
Well, it's interesting, Charles, because I think that some of the public discourse has suggested that, oh, maybe Howard Lutnick put his foot in his mouth, or maybe they're stumbling or bumbling around in this. I actually think it's a pretty on purpose, clear attempt to change public perception of the importance of Social Security, to move the public expectations about Social Security being that third rail that you talked about. And I think it's Republicans trying to change the conditions so that they can attack and gut Social Security. That's why you see them doing things like shutting down Social Security offices that have phone services that people rely upon. And that's why you see a lot of this public talk around people don't really need Social Security, or people won't miss it, or fraudsters are the only folks who will miss it. I think it's pretty purposeful. I think it's pretty clumsy and bumbly, but I think it's pretty purposeful what the administration's doing.
Charlie, I want to switch gears, and I want to talk to you about some of the appeasement that we've been seeing from some really elite and powerful institutions like Columbia University, and earlier we were talking about Paul Weiss, the law firm. You wrote that as we are seeing in real time, appeasement only emboldens the jackals and demoralizes other targets. And as Ben Franklin warned, provides neither liberty nor safety. Let's talk about this for a moment. How alarming is it that we have seen this appeasement from these institutions? And can it be in any way, shape, or form considered some degree of complicitness?
No, and there's no question about it. I mean, this great capitulation began even before Donald Trump was sworn in, and it is, it's the media, it is the billionaires, it is social media, these major law firms that are claiming that they face an existential threat. These are folks, by the way, that rake in $2.6 billion a year. And I think that, rather than engaging in collective action to say, no, we're going to protect the integrity of our industry, of democratic constitutional norms, they're figuring we're going to cut our own deal and maybe that will make us safe. But it doesn't make you safe. What it does is it emboldens Trump. And you can see this with Columbia caving in will lead to more attacks and more threats against higher education. The decision by Paul Weiss to cut a deal with Donald Trump has not made Trump back off. What it led to was this order over the weekend that will target every single law firm in America. What they are saying, and this is beyond any norm that we've ever experienced before, they are saying that if there is a law firm that is suing us or that is engaged in litigation and they do their job by filing a motion that we don't like, we're going to target them. We're going to go after them. We're going to try to put them out of business. Now, look, the legal profession in this country, if they stood shoulder to shoulder, could push back against this. But what we're seeing again and again and again has been this capitulation. And it's extended beyond government. It is extending to civil society. So if you want to run through the checklist of how do you fight tyranny, number one, do not obey in advance. And in case after case after case, they are obeying in advance and caving into pressure. And it's a very dangerous moment in American culture and in politics.
Charlie, you make some really good points there, and I want to follow up. Number one, you've talked about the fact that these are legitimate institutions with the ability to fight back, with the ability to push back. But yet and still, we're seeing a lot of compliance in various sectors, both public and private, before the actual mandate, the ink has dried. Does that suggest to you, without getting into conspiracy theories, that quite possibly there are folks who are at the decision-making tables who are actually okay with some of this agenda moving forward?
Yeah, yes, but I think most of it is just simply fear. It is that we need to protect our bottom line, we need to protect our clients, and they make that judgment. I think it's an erroneous judgment that they're making here. But also, what is really extraordinary, and and this goes back to the ABC settlement with Donald Trump, and maybe CBS's settlement with Donald Trump, this lawsuit, the executive order aimed at the law firms. These are clearly unlawful. They are bogus actions. They are unconstitutional. If they were challenged, they could win in court. And that's what makes them so extraordinary, is you have the surrender on issues that the overwhelming odds are that they would win, and yet they've decided they don't want the fight. They don't want the controversy. And that's what Donald Trump and his minions feed upon, the fear that we can bleed you, that we can embarrass you, and you're having one after another collapse. This country, again, Donald Trump has limited powers to do what he is doing. He only has the power that we are willing to cede him. And if you have Congress that surrenders, the courts that surrender, the legal profession that surrenders, the universities that surrender, then we become a very different country in a very short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Joel, you're the expert on Democratic strategy. I hear a lot from Democrats about the need to fight, and everyone wants to get into an actual fight when it comes to the future of this country. But yet, that seems to be something different and mean something different for all of Democrats. How do you get the party on one page where that actually means we are willing to get down in the mud and do what we need to do in order to move this country forward and stop what's happening. What does that look like, and how does it take shape?
Boy, Charles, I hope that in the couple of seconds I've got here, I can give a little bit of light to this. Look, I think Democrats have to do a few things. One, they've got to simplify what they want to do here. I think there are a lot of things to run at. That's actually part of the strategy, I think, of the Trump administration, is to put a lot of things out into the ether so that folks can get distracted easily and take their eye off the ball. I think focusing on a couple of things, figuring out who your best messengers are. I know there's been a lot of talk about, in the House Oversight Committee, Democrats chose Jerry Connolly over Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as an example. There's nothing to do with Jerry Connolly. He is a honorable public servant, a good guy. But clearly for this moment, you needed somebody who can cut through, who can win in the attention economy. And you've got to have folks that are thinking about, how do we get people's attention, and how do we hold their attention, and how do we persuade them? And you've got to find messengers who can do that, and you've got to match it up with a message that can bring together a majority opposition to Trump. Donald Trump and Republicans are going to create opportunities for you. You've got to create the conditions so those other things can come together.
Joel, you had a hard task cramming all that in just a few seconds. You did admirably at it. Thank you and Charlie for joining us tonight.